Okay, it's wonderful to be back here at Green College. I lived here for, I think, 3 years. And when Richard and Diana were also here, and they made it such a wonderful experience. A real place of ideas and friendship it was, and I'm sure it still is. I wrote my dissertation at that time when I lived here, and Richard being such a tall and imposing figure, it took such a long time for me to muster the courage to go to his office and ask him to be on my committee, but I'm really happy that I finally did that. Tom was my supervisor and Richard was on board, and it was really wonderful. It was, I think, the best thing that happened to me during my PhD, to have these two wonderful professors on board, and their approach to theory and empirical work allowed me to just write a dissertation and not have to worry about, have a theory chapter and methods chapter and data chapter. And I sort of was able to kind of integrate all of these throughout the dissertation. I wrote about how death was transformed from a fate, from something that we treat as a fate, and became something that we rather treat as a risk. Some of you have talked about insurance and crime and risk in the past couple of days. And these are salient themes in Richard's work. But we are going to talk about and focus on something that was more of a subtext in his writing, and that's this a relationship between empirical and theoretical work. And yesterday we were talking about Richard and how he had this rare gift of mixing masterful field work, empirical work, with theoretical insight, and he was so graceful in doing that and just weave them together so seamlessly. And so that's what we are going to focus on today, the forms and formats of empirical knowledge. And as we heard in Tony's wonderful talk yesterday, even the banana police force was interested in the forms and formatting of theoretical and empirical knowledge in Richard's work. So this concern has always been there, I think, in his works. I will start first with a sort of introduction. It is often argued that the concept of society as a zone of reality and as a problem space did not exist in ancient or medieval times, but was born out of the epochal upheavals of the modern era and the development of scientific techniques to explain them. Starting in the mid-17th century, these upheavals engendered two types of sociologically relevant problematizations, theoretical and empirical. On the one hand, philosophers from Hobbes to Rousseau to Hegel to Kant sought to uncover the historical laws and rule-bound dynamics of underlying social change. And at the same time, an army of philanthropists, activists, and state agents were engaged in empirical and often quantitative problematizations of new social ills, from crime to degeneracy, poverty, and spread of disease. And one of these philanthropists was James Kay, who I'm going to talk about later in relation to Marxist writing. In our view, modern sociological theory is rooted firmly in both of these intellectual traditions. As Thomas Osborne and Nicholas Rose have argued, social thought is in part an organic outcome of empirical articulations that created, quote, changing problem spaces within which sociological theories can offer themselves as answers. In this view, theories of society could only begin to be formulated after the field of society had itself become established as a problem. Established not just in a discursive sense, but in a practical and technical sense, as a terrain of investigation and as an investigable domain. By the mid-19th century, this domain had been firmly established through empirical and quantitative problematizations focusing in particular on the poor urban working classes as well as criminals and other social deviants. So this is this empirical side that today we are focusing on. Survey questionnaires as well as direct and participant observation had been used to document social ills, aggregate their occurrences, and present the results in tables and graphs. This quantitative engagement was highly inventive, political and moral, and often, in spite of itself, contributed significantly to the theoretical identification and conceptual formulation of a new field and object of study, which was society. In these works, personal afflictions, such as ill health, criminal tendencies, degeneracy, divorce, were presented as social problems or as collective problems arising from the nature of social aggregations, and therefore amenable to change and manipulation through institutions and governments. Again, as Osborne and Rose point out, a history of these social articulations would be a history of the ways in which claims have been made in the name of society, grievances uttered, explanations formulated, blame ascribed, cures pronounced. It would also be a history of another sense of social articulation, of connections established, relations assembled between issues, parts, zones, organs, and persons in a social language. Working within this framework requires rejecting the usual distinction between social thinkers and empirical researchers, the former supposedly casting their superior gaze out onto a world of abstractions from their ivory towers, while the latter venturing out into the field to get their hands dirty with real people living real lives. Rather, we propose to consider the reciprocity between the conceptual forms and empirical formats of knowledge, which characterize the birth of the social sciences, along with their moral inspirations and political applications.
So ironically, this moralizing distinction between theoretical speculation and empirical research ignores the fact that each of the three canonical figures of social thought made extensive use of empirical statistical data, which they format and display in combination with analytical historical narratives at various points in their careers. Weber in the beginning, Durkheim in the middle, Marx toward the end. And what we're going to do is open up that classical archive. It's actually of early sociology. It's Zohreh that's drawn my attention to this. I'll start by just tracking a little genealogy from Kemple, we heard a bit about this morning, to Tarde, to Durkheim, actually working backwards, and Zohreh will talk about K. Shuttleworth, his influence on Engels, and Engels' influence on Marx. So the first part, from Durkheim's data maps to Tarde's statistical curves by way of Kemple. Since Emil Durkheim is conventionally credited with the pioneering use of social statistics and other empirical data to advance his classic broader sociological thesis concerning the shift from traditional to modern societies, it is worth considering how he proposes to measure the rates and ratios of social processes on the basis of measurable variables. And I can maybe come back to that at the Q&A, this difference between a measuring measure and a measured measure, which I think all of the classics are aware of, if not explicitly, at least in the background. With crime, divorce, and most famously suicide as his empirical objects of study, Durkheim's fundamental principle, as he called it, involves thinking about social phenomena as elements in a factual order with its own objective reality. It's one of the fundamental principles of the rules of sociological method. Thus, with respect to particular social problems, such non-social factors as climate, psychology, and race are determined to be negligible, secondary, or dependent variables with respect to such primary, powerful, and independently operating social forces as religion, occupation, education, and marital status. And I have a bit more here on the statistical tables. I've done a sort of a systematic analysis of which kinds of tables he uses in which parts of his book on suicide. I'm going to skip that here. Although Durkheim's more lyrical and prosaic passages on egoism as a pathos of modernity and on anomie as a disease of the infinite may be more memorable for us today, his statistical tables and data maps lend to his argument a lasting aura of scientific realism, which is arguably even more significant in establishing his status as a classic. To be sure, Durkheim was far from the first social scientist to have made use of such visual models of explanation and statistical presentation. And in fact, much of the data he used was mined by his nephew and research assistant, the young Marcel Mauss, from the Bureau of Statistics managed by his older rival, Gabriel Tarde. Whereas Durkheim ostensibly differed from Tarde, the younger Durkheim, ostensibly differed from Tarde, was in insisting that a domain called society could be objectively studied as a self-sustaining form, a supra-individual unity, or a reality sui generis, emerging from the reciprocal and radiating influence of social interactions, as Durkheim put it. By contrast, in Tarde's view, sociology is best understood as a measuring device for magnifying what he called the cell form of life, of social life, and can therefore be characterized as a social microscope of intermental psychology, which can help us to focus on individual actions and interactions. As he states in The Law of Imitation, first published in 1888, the empirical basis of sociology rests on the accumulation of social statistics, which measure the propagation of beliefs, desires, types, and acts, the main purpose of which, like the techniques of archaeology, he says, is to trace inventions and the imitative additions of inventions. Sociology's aim is thus to trace changes in the curve of imitations and number of adherents to inventions with respect to similar and inverse variations in other curves. Such data can then be recorded on a table or plotted in a graph, which displays the relatively rapid rise, unstable plateaus, and gradual decline of a variety of complex phenomena across the entire terrain of the social field. It's a quote from Tarde's Laws of Imitations. When the field of sociological statistics has been clearly defined, when the curves relating to the propagation, that is to say, to the consolidation as well, of every special want and opinion for a number of years and over a certain stretch of a country have been plainly traced, the interpretation of these hieroglyphic curves that are at times as strange and picturesque as mountain profiles, that's the part I love right there. You'll see why in a minute. More often as sinuous and graceful as living forms has still to be made. So I actually think that part of Durkheim's data maps, which are kind of topography of social life, marriage, divorce, suicide, and crime, are literalized in these undulating curves of the statisticians that Tarde praises here. Despite his aesthetic and academic appreciation for the statistical maps of his contemporaries and predecessors, Tarde himself does not seem to have generated many of them himself, at least as far as we know so far. Perhaps the most significant pioneer of social statistics of the preceding generation and a major influence on Tarde and Durkheim was Adolphe Quetelet, whose knowledge of mathematical probabilities in astronomy led him to develop what he called a social physics for calculating the distribution of traits and value frequencies across populations according to the form of the familiar bell curve, or urn curve, as he called it, using another metaphor there. Can you turn that on now? So I'll just throw some of that. By the way, the BMI that Tom was talking about this morning, that's basically what you see here. If you can get a collection of traits, then you'll get a kind of classic normal distribution or bell curve, as you see on the top. At the extreme ends of a binomial graph representing the composite traits of average man, for example, one could go on to plot the distribution of particular deviations using similar curves, such as the graph Quetelet made on crime by age and sex in Belgium, at the bottom there. he was dividing the number of acts by the total number of persons in each category. So men are on the left, women are on the right, the mean is at the top, and the age, the different age groups are listed along the horizontal line at the bottom. As if to take the metaphorics of Tarde's view of such curves literally, Kemple interprets his statistical graph as indicating the propensity or inclination, penchant, as you see there, of men and women committing crimes at various ages. So this is actually meant to form a kind of risk assessment thing, and it's largely generated, I think, off the metaphorics of a steep incline and a gradual decline. So what are the propensities, what's the penchant of crime in any individual instance could be extrapolated from such a graph. Durkheim, Tarde, and Kemple agree that social life does not just constitute a factual order for scientific study and statistical analysis, but also a moral order subject to social reform and political intervention. Unlike Durkheim and Kemple, however, Tarde does not assume that statistical norms or mathematical means should also be considered moral ideals or critical standards for assessing the health and longevity of the body's social. That's the language that they use. Tarde, or rather Durkheim and Kemple. Rather than argue with Durkheim that the regulation of occupational groups through professional ethics would cure the social pathologies of excessive egoism and anomie, Tarde sees a general educational or even civic value in seeing and comprehending the temporal ups and downs of social life through time. So another quotation from the Laws of Imitation. In general, there is nothing more instructive than the chronological tables of statisticians in which they show us the increasing rise or fall, year by year, of some special kind of consumption or production, of some particular political opinion, as it is expressed in the returns of the ballot box, or of some specific desire for security that is embodied in fire insurance premiums, in savings banks accounts, and so on. These are all at bottom representations of the life of some desire or belief that has been imported and copied. Every one of these tables, or rather every one of the graphical curves which represent them, is in a way a historical monograph, end quote. Toward the end of his Laws of Imitation, Tarde describes what he calls the ideal newspaper. So he does see a civic function for these graphs and statistical data being disseminated to the public, which he imagines would be read, quote, merely for its multifarious statements of ungarnished fact, rather than for the ideological slant of its writers. Since such a periodical would be, as he puts it, full of graphical curves and succinct articles, it would not need political editorials. It would only, and thereby it would allow the critical intelligence of a numerate and literate public to formulate its own opinions and ideas.
Durkheim was not alone among the canonical sociological figures to devise plans for generating empirical data in support of their theories, or to make use of such data as justification for moral and political reform. In addition to drawing extensively from the so-called Blue Book reports on conditions in the factories for Volume 1 of Capital, which was first published in 1867, Karl Marx designed a survey questionnaire, which very few people know about, containing 99 questions addressed directly to French workers. It was published in the Revue Socialiste and in addition distributed in 25,000 copies to all labor organizations, socialists, and democratic groups, French newspapers, and individuals who requested copies. And this was in April 1880. So he wrote this in English, and then they Revue translated it to French. And as if 99 questions weren't enough, they actually added 2 more, including one at the end asking any general comments. So in the questionnaire, Marx, and by the way, this was published anonymously, so the Revue Socialiste doesn't say who was the author of the questionnaire. And then we only know that Marx wrote it because he actually refers to this questionnaire in a letter, and they also found the original English version. In the questionnaire, he called for support from workers who realized that only they can describe with full knowledge the evils which they endure, and that only they, not any providential saviors, can remedy the social ills from which they suffer. He also called upon the socialists of all schools who, in his words, desiring social reform must also desire exact and positive knowledge of the conditions in which the working class, the class to which the future belongs, lives and works. Marx assured respondents that not all the 99 questions had to be answered, but asked that any answers given be detailed and comprehensive. The goal was to classify and publish the results as monographs in the Revue Socialiste, and then again as a collected volume. A labor survey, as such, was not a new concept. England had set the precedence with parliamentary inquiries in the conditions of workers, which led to the reforms in work hours and limitation of the use of women and children. In addition, by the mid-19th century, British statistical societies had developed questionnaires and conducted numerous door-to-door surveys of the working classes in various industrial cities. Middle-class agents, armed with tabular questionnaires, knocked on every door that seemed to belong to a poor or working family, asking them a range of questions from the number of persons per house, the number of beds per house, the number of persons per bed, and what people read, did they go to church, and that sort of questions. The ultimate goal was to institute education reforms without addressing work conditions or wages. So these statistical societies, the people in them were essentially middle-class philanthropists, manufacturers, and bankers. One of them was James Kay, who was a physician, and then later he married an aristocratic woman and became Sir James Kay Shuttleworth. And he wrote a survey of Manchester and published it in 1832, a survey of working class conditions in Manchester. And despite his political disdain for members of the statistical societies, Engels actually read this survey. So you see that in this, we really thought about what technology best represents the work, and we came up with the transparency. So you see that it's kind of a tabular questionnaire, and they put questions there. The questions are very typical of the kind of questions that the statistical societies would ask. So for instance, you know, the condition of the house and how many rooms, and are they ventilated, and do they need to be whitewashed, and then number 17, remarks concerning food, clothing, and fuel, habits of life. So they wanted to get into like what kind of moral and sort of moral habits anyway they had. Did they read, did they drink, that sort of thing. How many families, and did they have lodgers, which is essentially immigrants living there in the cellars. So these are the type of questions that were asked, and the result was this scathing report on the conditions of the working poor in Manchester. Engels read this, so this was 1832, and he wrote his own book on the condition of the working class in England, and he drew extensively on Kay's work. Engels' work was published in 1845, and then Marx read this work, and he became friends with Engels, and so we have this genealogy going from Kay to Engels to Marx. And then later on, 40 years later, Marx actually creates his own questionnaire, which is very different from this one, and I'll talk about that. Against this background, Marx's questionnaire was an attempt both to introduce such inquiries to the French context and to put workers in charge of distributing the questionnaire. Marx's questionnaire was different from most previous surveys in its overtly political nature. The goal was to put the spotlight on what mattered most, not morality or education, but rather working conditions, and to arm the workers with the revolutionary consciousness of their own conditions. But given Marx's comments on the British surveys, comments he made in the Capital, it is clear that even if some modest reforms were resulted from this study, he would have been happy. The questionnaire was so political that it is cited today in some methodology textbooks that strive for objectivity as an example of how not to design survey questionnaires. Workers were invited to report on their wages, their working hours, whether they performed unpaid labor, whether they were compensated for work injuries, whether such compensation was required and enforced by law, and questions such as the division of labor within the workshop, whether it was in a rural setting or urban area, what happened to the products after they were produced, were they produced for the domestic market or was it for export? So the kind of questions are very different from Kay's, in that instead of asking questions that are just simply factual questions, he's trying to get at these social relations of production that exists around the life of a worker. And some of those have global dimensions, such as where is this product going? And we won't have time to discuss this, but we think that a lot of the questions that the classical figures, such as Marx and Durkheim and even Weber, who we don't discuss today, were asking were questions that were trying to get at the sort of what Wallerstein calls the relational kind of data that try to get at the bottom of where does this phenomena come from, how is it related to the other ones, and where it is going. So that's how we get Durkheim's historical and comparative study of suicide. That's how we get Marx's Capital and his survey, and Weber's earlier writings on the kind of place of agrarian labor in German society. These questions not only elicited responses from workers, but opened up new possibilities for critical thought and radical action to them. While philanthropists treated the workers as objects of welfare measures, Marx saw the workers capable of becoming masters of their own fate as they become aware of their situation. A later issue of the Revue Socialiste includes a note, possibly by Marx, reporting that some questionnaires had already been returned, but urging our friends to submit their answers quickly to help make the survey as complete as possible. The writer calls upon them to reflect that the completion of these carrières de travail, these labor lists, is of the greatest importance, and that by participating in our difficult task, they are working directly for their own liberation. But unfortunately, he died 3 years later, and we really don't know what happened to the data that was gathered.
Should we finish up? Okay.
But there's quick. Do you want to read it, or do you want just read the last paragraph? Okay, please.
Well, actually, where we're going with this is, well, we actually see this integration or reciprocity between theory and empiricism as laying a sociological foundation for later arguments for a public or even a political sociology. So we did want to end, besides bemoaning the current state of the discipline and the severe separation between the methods and theory, with Richard's take on this. In the course of his career, Richard Erikson made numerous political statements about the role of the sociologist in producing empirical and theoretical knowledge in accessible formats, which are culturally relevant, socially significant, and politically useful. His disagreement with then American Sociological Association President Michael Burawoy's celebration of public sociology in 2005, for example, was not based on any ideological or methodological differences between them. Rather, Erikson seizes the occasion to express his commitment to and deeper understanding of the past promise and present potential of sociology to foster, in Richard's words, unfettered intellectual inquiry which yields knowledge that is at once professional, critical, policy, and public, and that improves the human condition, unquote. Where Bourgeois views these analytically distinct tasks as practically differentiated functions within a hierarchical division of academic and professional labor, with statistical empirical knowledge occupying a privileged position by virtue of its proximity to institutions of power. Erickson, by contrast, points out that, I'm paraphrasing and quoting a bit from him here, quantitative data on populations that contribute to government programs of security, well-being, prosperity, and autonomy have an irreducibly moral and potentially political character insofar as they convey an urgency for principled courses of action. As he and Nico Ster argue in their edited collection on governing modern societies, insofar as political participation is increasingly grounded in both readily accessible and scientifically sanctioned knowledge, such knowledge may foster the deliberate choice to abstain from participation, as well as critical interpretation, review, and resistance to government-initiated action. Taking such perceptive comments as inspiration, our aim here has been to recover some of the classic precedents and to some of their classic precedents, and to consider how they can help us understand not just how theoretical empirical work can be integrated through well-chosen knowledge formats and modes of dissemination, but also how sociological insights can contribute to public debate and critical discussion on matters of political and not just academic concern. Thank you.
Have a seat. Thank you very much. Let's take at least a few minutes for questions. We're running just a wee bit behind, but I'm trying to keep us roughly on schedule. So, Sean, you want to start us off?
Yeah. This capturing of scientific or pseudo-scientific data in order to advance a social political by no means old-fashioned. We do it now. I have a wonderful one here from, there's a whole department, the University of Aberdeen, St Andrews, which collects statistics on the deaths from Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. New variants, you know, mad cow disease? And they measured them from 1990 and they still keep them, and it started off with 33 deaths a year and went up 47, 96, there was 60 deaths a year. Peaked at 108 in 03, it's been going down steadily since then. Wonderful news, it enables all sorts of political actions to be taken to stamp out mad cow disease in the UK. Comparative statistics from around the world, 0. Nobody else outside of the UK dies of mad cow disease. Why? Because their autopsies are done to check it, right? Now, this has knock-on effects. In Canada, there are a serious number of people who don't get enough blood because the health agency, the blood collection agency in Canada, does not collect blood from anybody who's been in the UK for more than 6 months in the past 30 years. Because they're all potential carriers of CJV, and these statistics prove that don't forget that there is between 525 to 540,000 deaths every year in the UK.
Focus the question though, because
yeah. That's the point. You are hijacking dubious information to advance an agenda.
See, what you call hijacking, Tarde, which is why I liked, which I actually found new appreciation for him, calls interpretation, and he actually leaves the interpretation for the reader, especially the civically minded, educated reader, and I sort of like that, in contrast to Kemple, who takes the statistical norm as a moral ideal, right? And we do get a lot of that in the BMI, you know, like you're not a beautiful or a healthy person unless you have reached the standard of body mass index, for example. And I think that's what interested me, is that Kemple saw the problem with seeing a statistical norm as a moral ideal and said, when we're interpreting the data, that's a distinct thing from when we're generating and even displaying it in beautiful mountains, for example.
Tom? No? Wow, okay. I do want to point out, I was struck with the, was it Shuttleworth's questionnaire that Zohreh was showing? I mean, you could see there some of the themes of the kind of miasma medicine, ventilation, the whitewashing of the buildings, the cleanliness of the, it's a medical vision of what quality of life for workers.
Yeah, he was a doctor, he was a physician.
Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Mm.